HOA evicted my family. A decade ago, now I'm back as their governor. The look on Karen Wheeler's face was priceless as I stepped out of the government SUV with my security detail. She actually stumbled backward, recognition dawning in her eyes. 10 years ago, she physically shoved my disabled veteran father and got us evicted over a wheelchair ramp. Today, I'm returning as Governor Mitchell with the power to shut down her entire HOA empire. Is that Rachel Mitchell? Someone whispered as I walked toward the community center. The same perfect lawns, the same beige houses, the same brass HOA rule plaques at every corner. But everything else had changed. I was just 16 when Karen showed up at our door, her manicured finger jabbing at my father's chest. Remove that eyesore or face consequences, she had sneered about his wheelchair ramp. 1 month later, my dad, a decorated war hero who lost his leg in combat, was homeless. What Karen never expected was that the terrified teenage girl watching through the window would spend 10 years planning this exact moment of justice. Karen Wheeler, the HOA president, had shown up at our door that spring morning, clipboard in hand, her blonde highlights perfectly styled even at 7 a.m. I remember watching from the living room window as my dad opened the door, still in his bathrobe. "This unauthorized structure needs to be removed immediately," Karen announced, shoving a violation notice into my father's hands. "The HOA board met last night and voted unanimously. You have 48 hours. My father tried to explain. The ramp was temporary until the proper contractors could install something that matched the house aesthetic. But Karen wasn't interested in explanations. "Rules are rules," she said, her voice dripping with fake sweetness. "If we make an exception for you, we'd have to make exceptions for everyone. Property values would plummet." When my dad pointed out that the Americans with Disabilities Act protected his right to access his own home, something in Karen snapped. "This isn't about your disability," she hissed. "It's about you thinking you're special, that the rules don't apply to you." And then in a moment I'll never forget, she actually shoved him, a disabled veteran, with both hands, causing him to stumble backward into the house. That physical confrontation was just the beginning. Within days, the harassment escalated. Daily inspections of our property, violation notices for everything from grass height to the color of our curtains. Dad tried to fight back legally, but Karen's husband was on the city council and her brother worked for the local court. Our complaints went nowhere. Within 3 months, they'd manufactured enough violations to place a lien on our home. Within 6 months, we were evicted. A disabled veteran and his teenage daughter forced to leave the house we'd loved, all because of a power-hungry HOA president who couldn't tolerate a simple wooden ramp. We moved in with my aunt 2 states away. Dad was never the same after that. The humiliation broke something in him. He'd survived war only to be defeated by a suburban tyrant with a clipboard. I promised myself that day that I would make something of my life, that I would find a way to ensure what happened to us couldn't happen to others. That promise carried me through law school, through my early political career, and eventually to the governor's office. And now, 10 years later, I was back. Not as that frightened teenage girl, but as Governor Mitchell, with the power to sign legislation that would transform HOA regulations across the state. As I walked toward the Oakwood Estates Community Center for the town hall meeting I'd arranged, people started coming out of their houses. Some faces I recognized from childhood. But they looked at me differently now, with a mix of surprise and respect. The community center was packed when I arrived. At the front of the room stood Karen Wheeler, somehow looking almost exactly the same. Same blonde highlights, same perfectly pressed pantsuit, same look of smug authority. She'd been the HOA president for 15 consecutive years now, a dynasty of suburban tyranny. "Governor Mitchell," she gushed, extending her hand as I approached the podium. What an honor to welcome you to Oakwood Estates. We're so proud to have such an esteemed visitor. She had no idea who I was. The teenage girl from 10 years ago had grown up, changed her hair, lost the braces. But I remembered her. Every line of her face was etched in my memory. I didn't take her hand. Instead, I smiled and turned to address the crowd. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for coming. For those who don't know me, I'm Governor Rachel Mitchell. A murmur went through the crowd, some connecting the dots to the Mitchell family that once lived here. Karen's smile faltered slightly. I've chosen Oakwood Estates for a very specific reason today. This community represents everything that's wrong with how homeowners associations operate in our state. Karen's smile disappeared completely now, replaced by a look of confusion and alarm. 10 years ago, I continued, a family in this very community was evicted from their home. Their crime, installing a wheelchair ramp for a disabled veteran. People shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Many of them had been here when it happened. Many had said nothing. That disabled veteran was my father, Sergeant James Mitchell. The room fell completely silent. I could feel every eye on me, including Karen's, which had widened in shock as recognition finally dawned. The HOA president at that time personally harassed our family, even physically pushing my disabled father during one confrontation. Karen stepped forward, her face flushed. Governor, there seems to be some misunderstanding. The Mitchell family violated multiple HOA regulations. I held up my hand, cutting her off. Ms. Wheeler, I have the floor now. My voice was steady, professional, the voice of someone who could not be intimidated anymore. After what happened to my family, I promised myself I would make changes. Today, I'm announcing that I will be signing the Housing Accessibility and Protection Act, which will significantly limit the power of HOAs to enforce aesthetic regulations over necessary medical accommodations. The crowd erupted in murmurs. I noticed several elderly residents nodding in approval. They'd probably faced their own battles with Karen's regime. Furthermore, I continued, my office has been investigating reports of financial irregularities in several HOAs across the state. I paused, letting my gaze meet Karen's directly, including Oakwood Estates. Her face went from flushed to pale in an instant. We've discovered some concerning patterns in how violation fees are collected and distributed. The state attorney's office will be conducting a full audit, effective immediately. Karen's hand gripped the edge of a nearby table. This is a personal vendetta. You can't use your position as governor to— This isn't personal, Ms. Wheeler, I interrupted, though we both knew that wasn't entirely true. This is about justice, about ensuring that what happened to my family doesn't happen to others. I turned to address the crowd again. How many of you have been unfairly targeted by excessive HOA regulations? Hands slowly began to rise throughout the room. First just a few, then more, until nearly half the room had their hands up. The Housing Accessibility and Protection Act will also create a state oversight committee for HOAs, I explained. Any fine over $100 will require review by this committee, and homeowners will have a clear path to appeal decisions they believe are unfair or discriminatory. The crowd broke into applause. Not everyone, but enough to know I had support. Karen wasn't just facing the governor. She was facing a community that had grown tired of her tyranny. As the meeting continued, more residents came forward with stories. Mr. Johnson described how he'd been fined for having a basketball hoop for his grandchildren. Mrs. Patel had been cited for growing vegetables in her backyard. The Martinez family had received violations for having too many cars when their adult children visited during holidays. Each story painted a picture of an HOA that had lost sight of its purpose. When The formal meeting ended. I noticed Karen slipping out a side door. My security detail followed me as I caught up with her in the parking lot. "Ms. Wheeler," I called out. She turned, her face a mask of barely controlled rage. "You won't get away with this," she hissed. "I have connections. Your little law won't pass." I smiled, feeling strangely calm. "It already has passed, Karen. I'm signing it tomorrow, and those connections you're counting on, the State Ethics Committee is investigating them too." I stepped closer, lowering my voice. "You pushed my father, a man who had lost his leg serving this country. You made him feel worthless in his own home. Then, you took that home away." For the first time, I saw something like shame flicker across her face. "It was just a ramp," she whispered, almost to herself. "It was never just about the ramp," I replied. "It was about power. You couldn't stand that someone would challenge your authority even when the rules were wrong." The next morning, as news cameras rolled, I signed the Housing Accessibility and Protection Act into law. "This bill is dedicated to my father, Sergeant James Mitchell," I said, "and to every homeowner who has faced discrimination, harassment, or unfair treatment at the hands of their HOA." My father watched from the front row, his eyes wet with tears. After losing our house, he'd never bought another one, too afraid of ending up in another HOA nightmare. "Maybe now, Dad," I said, looking directly at him. "You can have a home with a garden again." 3 months later, the state audit of Oakwood Estates HOA was complete. The findings were worse than anyone expected: hundreds of thousands in misappropriated funds, selective enforcement of rules against residents Karen disliked, even evidence that she'd used HOA contractors for renovations on her own home. Criminal charges were filed. Karen resigned in disgrace. Sometimes I drive past our old house on my way home from the capital. The new owners have painted it blue, something Karen would have never allowed. And on the front porch, there's a permanent ramp, beautifully constructed to match the home's architecture. Last week I noticed something new. A small plaque that reads, "The Mitchell Memorial Ramp, because everyone deserves access to their home." Looking back, I realized that losing our home was the beginning of finding my purpose. When Karen pushed my father that day, she had no idea she was setting in motion events that would not only lead to her downfall, but to reforms that would help thousands of homeowners across the state. Sometimes the people we hurt the most become the ones with the power to change the system.